In what is no doubt its final stop, the original Darksiders returns, this time on Nintendo Switch. And if you haven't played it, Darksiders is a wonderful action game in the style of The Legend of Zelda or Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver with its own post-apocalyptic trimmings. There are loads of puzzles, dungeons, combat, and more packed in here, and of the 3 games in the Darksiders series, the first one remains my favorite. So how does it fare on Switch? After all, Darksiders doesn't really have the best track record when it comes to technical performance. Can you expect smooth performance in this version? And how do the visuals hold up compared to the original release and the other versions of the remaster? Let's find out. Darksiders was first released in 2010 for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, and while it's a wonderful game, it launched with some rather serious technical flaws. I own the game on PlayStation 3, and as you can see, the performance is less than optimal, with lots of screen tearing and slowdown throughout the entire game. A later PC release managed to solve these issues for the most part, but honestly, it was never a technically solid game. Until late 2016, that is, when Darksiders received the Warmastered Edition, a remastered version of the game for PS4, Xbox, and the PC. Developed by Kaiko here in Germany, the Warmastered Edition delivers a smooth 60 frames per second frame rate while offering support for the newly released, at least at the time, PlayStation 4 Pro. It was a great version of the game. And then, months later, Nintendo fans received their own version of the original Darksiders on Wii U. Now, this is after the launch of the Nintendo Switch, so this release is a rather strange conversion indeed. I don't have this one myself, but as I understand it, it runs at 30 frames per second instead of 60 and maxes out at 720p. Now, however, almost 2 years later, the Switch receives its own version of Darksiders that just happens to fall halfway between the Wii U conversion and its bigger brothers. And it's an interesting port with plenty of tweakable options. The first of which you may notice are the performance and quality modes. This version gives you a choice, so what's the difference then? Well, basically when playing in docked mode, Darksiders runs at full 1080p in quality mode, but caps the frame rate at 30 frames per second. When using the performance mode, however, the frame rate is unlocked and the resolution dropped to 1440 by 810. In practice, you lose some clarity on distant textures, and texture filtering itself is reduced, but it's comparable. When playing in portable mode then, the 30 FPS mode runs at a full 1280 by 720 and looks supremely sharp on the Switch LCD. The performance mode then drops to 540p instead. When toggling between the two modes though, you may notice that the resolution change applies equally to the text and HUD elements. The entire user interface renders at whatever resolution you're using, which means playing at 810p yields blurrier text and fuzzier UI elements all around. The docked mode also includes improved anti-aliasing over portable and slightly improved texture filtering, though honestly texture filtering is not this game's strong suit. Beyond that, the options menu also allows you to disable the vignette option and chromatic aberration. In the case of Darksiders, however, I actually prefer these effects myself as I feel they smooth out and help conceal the often low polygon environments, but of course the choice is yours. When compared against the PS4 Pro version of the game then, the results are rather interesting. In general, the two versions are extremely similar visually in all the ways you might expect. The game's assets, including those updated for the remastered version's original release, including textures, character models, scene geometry, and the like, all pretty much appear identical at a first glance. But if you start looking closer, you may begin to spot the differences. The most obvious of them stems from resolution and texture filtering, both of which are reduced from the PS4 Pro version here. But I also feel that the Switch version has a slightly washed out appearance that differs from the PS4 version. This is most evident here. This gaping stone figure exhibits a subtle blue lighting on PlayStation 4 that is seemingly absent in the Switch version. And if we swap over to the PS3 version, it's clear that the PS4 version is more faithful to the original as well. Now the PS3 version obviously lacks the remastered textures, but the lighting is what differs most on Switch. It's not something you would necessarily notice under normal gameplay conditions, mind you, and it's something I didn't pick up on until doing these side-by-side comparisons, but when you do just that, the differences are revealing. Yet despite this, the game still looks better overall than the 2010 original, and features the remastered assets throughout. That means sharper textures all around, and other subtle improvements. Loading times are also extremely quick on the Switch, and more importantly, once you get past the initial loading screen from the main menu, the rest of the game plays out seamlessly. The game relies on data streaming to allow you to run between all the different areas without staring at load screens. The seamlessness of the world adds a lot to the game experience, I feel. But it's perhaps the performance where things become most interesting. With both quality and performance modes available in docked and portable, we have a fair few number of options to examine here. So let's start with the game's performance mode, running while docked. Here, Darksiders targets 60 frames per second, and by and large, it does manage to reach this target. This first test here takes place during one of the first boss fights in the game. It's a relatively standard battle, but you can see that the frame rate tends to drop into the upper 50s or so at points during the battle. It can start to dip a little more, however, when the screen fills up with alpha particles and effects. The combat in this section, for instance, hangs below 60 FPS for an extended period of time until the screen is clear of these enemies. So while it is mostly 60 frames per second, you're going to run into situations like this where it just can't quite hold it. While simply running around the map, however, the average level of performance is nearly perfect. For this test, we're looking here at the game running on both PS4 Pro and Nintendo Switch. This hearty jaunt through the city streets reveals nearly identical performance between the two different versions. Both consoles exhibit an occasional duplicate frame like this, but it's overwhelmingly very steady and smooth. And thus far, this is exactly what you can expect from most exploration. Simply running around the game world produces very smooth frame rates, and most drops only appear when the combat heats up and alpha effects start to fill the screen. Well, kinda like this. This is the same area we were just running through, but this time it's filled with enemies. Whether engaged in combat or simply weaving through the enemies, the average frame rate drops just below 60 frames per second and seems to hang there. It does appear that simply spawning enemies into the area has an impact on the system resources and can drop the frame rate. This doesn't appear to be an overly common occurrence based on my early time with the game, but it is something to consider, and it does pop up now and again. Now, in comparison, the game's 30 frames per second mode seems to stick to its frame rate target with little issue. The potential certainly exists for an occasional duplicate frame here or there, but it seems to be quite uncommon. You can expect a stable 30 frames per second in this mode, which is a massive improvement over the 2010 version of the original game. The PlayStation 3 version just isn't smooth at all. When it comes to choosing between the two, I feel like the game manages to go above my threshold. Basically, if you have a game with an unlocked frame rate and the average frame rate is in the 40s, I will typically prefer to lock it down at 30 for consistency. But in the case of Darksiders, the average frame rate is almost always locked at 60 FPS, except in these types of situations. So if you can accept some minor slowdown in these scenes, it definitely plays better using the performance mode. But what if we switch to portable mode? Well, from what I've experienced, the performance option when running in portable mode is roughly the same as docked mode. Once again, it mostly hits 60 frames per second, but you will run across dips in certain areas. The loss in resolution is extremely obvious though, even though it's only 540p and we have seen lower resolution Switch games. It does look blurry on the Switch screen, but it does also feel excellent playing a game like this at 60 FPS in handheld mode. Now, the quality mode then delivers the expected 30 FPS frame rate with improved image quality, just like in docked. However, you now get a 1:1 pixel mapped image on the Switch's 720p screen, so it ends up looking really nice. Either way, no matter how you choose to play the game, it's great to have the option to select between the two. It's also worth bearing in mind that all four options are an improvement over the original PS3 and 360 version of the game, and an improvement over the Wii U version released in 2017. The PS4, Xbox One, and indeed PC versions still have an edge in terms of image quality and performance, but honestly, the Switch version holds its own. No matter how you play it though, the game holds up better than I expected. It was never a gorgeous game to begin with, I suppose, but the stylized approach to visuals helps prevent it from feeling especially dated. My main complaint here remains the introduction to the game. The first 30 minutes really isn't a great way to kick off a game like Darksiders. You might stumble into this thinking that it's basically just a straightforward linear action game, but in reality there's a lot more to it than that, so I do suggest sticking with it. So it's a great game, and it runs nicely on the Switch. It isn't the best version of Darksiders by any means, but it's surprisingly close to matching its bigger brothers. The fact that it's so much better than the previous generation versions make this worthy of the Warmastered name, certainly more so than the Wii U version at least. If you haven't played Darksiders then, give this one a shot. It's a great Zelda-like game and it works beautifully on Switch. It's a proper single-player experience packed full of content. But that's all for now. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to let us know by liking, subscribing, ringing the notification bell to help out the channel, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John, signing off.